Here's an idea. Sword Art Online is a good show. Fuck you. Fight me. 5 years ago, that wouldn't have been that controversial of a statement, but nowadays, due to certain anime YouTubers, it seems almost impossible to be a credible anime critic if you have any positive thoughts on the show at all. So fuck it, let's break the mold and do something a little bit different. Here's the reasons why I love Sword Art Online. The first reason is undoubtedly going to be the most controversial. The main character himself, Kirito. A big complaint about him is how he constantly acts like the edgy, a buzzword I'm really getting tired of at this point, lone wolf who doesn't want to join any guilds even though logically it would make more sense to help him get through the game easier. While narrative-wise this behavior doesn't make much sense, especially since he does join Asuna's guild not long after, there is a reason that I relate to this attitude. I've always been a solo gamer myself who really doesn't like playing games with other people. That's a good segue into my next biggest reason. I don't like MMORPGs. One of the biggest complaints I constantly see of SAO is how the series isn't really like an MMO. It introduces a lot of concepts without going too deep into any of them, and has a lot of aspects such as the lack of individual classes and other things that tends to piss off people who play MMOs all the time. However, for me this is perfect because I don't like MMORPGs. To use a common comparison, let's take, say, Log Horizon for example. Log Horizon bored the fuck out of me most of the time for multiple reasons, but the biggest is because it really goes in depth with the concepts of MMOs. I suppose it's nice for people who are really into MMORPGs, but for me, there's no type of video game that's more boring than an MMO. And this is coming from someone who enjoys collectathons in games, which is one of the biggest poisons with most video game critics. The first reason is, as I explained before, I prefer to play games alone, and MMOs require you to be a team player. It's the same reason I don't play normal online multiplayer games as well. Another reason is because I'm not a fan of the whole idea of classes to begin with. It's not that I don't understand them. Every person gets to choose a class which attributes them certain capabilities and denies them other capabilities, giving them specific strengths and weaknesses. In a well-designed MMO, this does help to balance all of the game's characters while forcing the players to utilize strategy a lot of the time to figure out how to best make use of the abilities that they have. There are a few problems here, however. To me, it's really boring to be given such a limited amount of abilities that you can perform and to have to coordinate with your teammates in order to use them effectively. I guess this is just because I play RPGs like Infamous. In Infamous, the main character, Cole McGrath, has the power of electricity, and using this, he possesses the general capabilities of the entire holy trinity of MMO classes: tank, healer, and DPS, or damage per second. In MMOs, the tank is able to take most of the damage, the DPS is able to deal most of the damage, and the healer is responsible for keeping the other party members alive. In Infamous, Cole is able to gain a lot of different powerful attacks to deal gigantic amounts of damage. He gains a shield which, when used properly, allows you to take gigantic amounts of damage, and can absorb electricity to heal his own wounds. At first glance, it seems like this would make the game too easy, but the game balances itself out in a very simple way, by having the enemies not only get progressively harder to defeat and making their attacks more powerful, but they also start coming in much larger quantities. And if that's still not hard enough for you, then you can play the game on hard mode, which will almost certainly give you struggle unless you're like a master gamer or something. Billy Mitchell would probably get through the game pretty easily, but most people, I'd imagine, would have a lot of trouble with it. Oh, and I'm also not good when it comes to strategy either. Yeah, that's a bit of an issue. In Infamous, being strategic would be helpful, but it's not absolutely necessary. The next two reasons I like this show are kind of short, but still worth mentioning. The first is the action scenes. There seems to be a misconception in the anime community that the animation in Sword Art Online isn't good just because there's movement. However, some people don't seem to realize that movement and fluidity is good animation inherently. That is, if the stuff on screen is moving instead of just the screen itself or the background, which doesn't count. Animation is all about what's on screen always moving, always changing, always evolving. Some people seem to have a false impression that just because you have detailed art or shiny colorful characters and or backgrounds that you have good animation, but that's not true at all. Art and animation are separate matters entirely. Sorry for this tangent, but it just makes me so mad to see people being wrong about everything all the time. Moving on, I also like the swords. Yes, I'm almost 23 and I'm able to admit that I can watch a show for the swords. Fight me. Also, in case anyone's curious, my favorite's the rapier that Asuna wields. The other reason is the world. Yeah, it could have been a lot better, but the look of SAO's world is truly incredible. This gigantic, wonderful fantasy world filled to the brim with fantasy races and creatures brings out the little kid in me consuming an endless amount of fantasy stories as a kid, while a huge tower in the center is my favorite part. A lot of people were disappointed that they didn't show all 100 of the floors in the tower, but I would think that would get pretty boring after a while, personally. I mean, it would take an unimaginably imaginative writer to be able to come up with 100 unique and interesting floors with unique designs and unique creatures and bosses to battle. The last thing I like in SAO, which I think in this case is a double-edged sword, is the concept. Now follow me for a second. The concept of a show really doesn't mean anything in the long run. A show with a shit concept can usually be saved with great writing, and a show with a great concept can be kneecapped by shitty writing. However, most people wouldn't deny that the two ways SAO's concept is appealing. The first and most obvious is being trapped in a video game is inherently interesting. It's by no means original. Hell, the .hack franchise has been going on in many incarnations of anime, manga, novels, and video games since 2002. There were two other shows, Batum and Reki Kawahara's very own A Cell World, that started the same year, 2012. And later on, 2014 brought us two more shows, Overlord and Log Horizon, which I already mentioned earlier in this video. And I know that I'm missing a lot more. However, SAO was able to reach a much larger audience by not going into detail with any of the MMO concepts, which, as I mentioned before, I definitely appreciated. More than that, though, I liked what Reki Kawahara was attempting to do with this setup. He was trying to tell a story of PTSD. If you haven't noticed, it's completely obvious. I mean, the characters are trapped in a video game, and if they die in the game, they die in real life. Because of this, logic would dictate that due to them forming friendships and even romances with the people who died, they would suffer from PTSD in similar ways that soldiers do on the battlefield in real life. I think this is genius because it's a fantastic way to create a story of PTSD while being able to aim it towards younger audiences. After all, most kids wouldn't be interested in a standard war story. Hell, even I'm not interested in standard war stories. Anyways, that pretty much sums up why I liked Sword Art Online. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing to my channel and following me on Twitter if you feel so inclined. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.